I focus a lot on metabolic health as a scientist, and we have a metabolic problem. This paper reported recently that the rate of optimal metabolic health was alarmingly low. That was their words. And they found that only 12% of U.S. adults were considered metabolically healthy. Now, metabolic health is a word that is a phrase that's not going anywhere. In fact, if anything, we're going to see or hear that term be invoked much more frequently. As a scientist, I like precision, and I want terms to be as precise as I like my haircut to be. So let's be a little more thorough in the definition. What is metabolic health? The report that I just shared with you defines metabolic health based on the metabolic syndrome. This is a cluster of complications that always clumps together. And we know that where one pops up, the others are generally right around the corner. But in our pursuit of precision, I have to inform you that what we call the metabolic syndrome was once called the insulin resistance syndrome. In fact, it even had an older name before that. But insulin resistance isn't as sexy a term as metabolic, and so metabolic syndrome is the term that is stuck. But when you hear metabolic health or metabolic syndrome, my hope is more and more that you actually think about insulin resistance. And in addition to just how prevalent it has become, we have to admire how relevant it is, which is that insulin resistance is a foundational cause or contributor to virtually every chronic disease, including those listed here. And beyond the high mortality diseases, insulin resistance is fundamental to problems of infertility. Indeed, the most common forms of infertility in men and women, erectile dysfunction and PCOS respectively, are consequences of insulin resistance. And even other disorders that are perhaps the most sobering of all, like Alzheimer's disease and other disorders of the mind, share a common metabolic core. You can see why this is a drum I beat so loudly, because the opportunity to address so much disease by focusing on one single target is just too alluring to not talk about. So I've mentioned insulin resistance. I'm introducing it as the main character in my story, but I realize you might not know what it is yet. So insulin resistance is a pathology with two parts, or a coin with two sides. The first part of it is the one that you automatically think of when you think about insulin resistance, which is that the cells are becoming somewhat deaf to the knocking on the door, which is insulin. Insulin's coming and knocking on the door of the cell, and the cell isn't responding very well anymore. Now, that is not a universal phenomenon, just so you're aware. Not every cell of the body has the same deafness or resistance that other cells may have. But importantly, there's a second part to this, like I mentioned, and that is that blood insulin levels are elevated. That is the side of the coin that most people don't ever flip over to see, but it is inseparable. There is no such thing as insulin resistance without hyperinsulinemia, or elevated blood insulin. And the two of those together, and indeed they always come together, help us actually flesh out how insulin resistance, with its two parts, contributes to chronic disease. In some instances, it's because of the high insulin. In other instances, it's because of the insulin resistance. So just keep in mind that those two problems always come together. Now let me present an alternative paradigm, which is the average individual who is going in for an annual wellness visit and having their glucose levels checked every year. Unfortunately, our glucose-centric paradigm makes it so that we don't detect insulin resistance as early as we could. Because while we're waiting patiently for someone's glucose to start to rise as we measure it at a fasted level, if we actually had been measuring insulin during the same span of time, we would find that there was a period of time where insulin was significantly elevated, but it was sufficient to keep glucose normal. This is insulin resistance in its earliest stages, where glucose is still normal, but insulin is having to work a little harder, if you will, in order to keep the glucose in that normal range. And so if our metrics are based solely on glucose, it's going to be undiagnosed, undetected. And then, unfortunately, it's only once the glucose starts to climb, because the insulin resistance has become so substantial, that now we detect the problem with our glucose-centric paradigm. But again, the problem is that we could have detected the issue years ahead of time, but we were looking at the wrong marker. We were looking at the sidekick glucose, thinking it was the main character. And again, that should be insulin. Okay, now, you know what the villain is. You know what who the main character is, insulin resistance. You know what it is. Let's talk about its origin story. There are actually multiple origins of insulin resistance, what I increasingly refer to as fast insulin resistance and slow insulin resistance. For the sake of time, I will focus on the one that is common, and I would argue the most important, which is too much insulin. Too much insulin is the main cause of insulin resistance. Now, if you're really paying attention, you will think through this circular problem that I presented, because I just got done saying that too much insulin is insulin resistance. And I'm saying that too much insulin is the main cause of insulin resistance. The problem with this is, as you have more insulin to try to overcome the resistance, you become even more insulin resistant because that's the main driver. And indeed, you begin to see why this problem has become literally the single most health problem worldwide. In Corey's introduction, she noted that I did my fellowship studies with Duke Medical School, but in Singapore, of all places, which incidentally is much prettier than Durham's campus. So my wife was delighted by that move. But why would Singapore care about metabolic health? It's because they actually have higher rates of diabetes than we do. It's a uniquely American trait to think we're the fattest and the sickest, and we're actually neither. We're not the fattest, we're not the most diabetic. And I can say that as a foreigner. No one hates America like Americans. Not to get political. Okay, is it common, though, to have high insulin? If I'm presenting the paradigm that chronically elevated insulin is a primary driver of insulin resistance, is the main stimulus even relevant? Well, let's put things in sobering perspective. If you look globally at the composition of macronutrients, you would look at how much are people eating fats or proteins or carbohydrate. 70% of all calories consumed globally come from carbohydrates. Within the United States, it's around 60%. Now, unfortunately, this is not coming from whole fruits and vegetables. It's carbohydrates coming from bags and boxes with barcodes. Those are the ones we want to be careful with, of course. Now, what do each of these macronutrients do to insulin? Well, unfortunately, the story continues to go quite badly for us. If someone eats pure fat, there is no response to insulin. Please note, if you will, that in the corner of some of my slides, I have a little PMID. That is just the PubMed identification number. If you're curious about any of these studies, including this one, take a little shot, and then you can look it up later. But what I've done here is just simply superimposed my own aesthetic onto an actual study that was published. For a guy who looks like me, you wouldn't think I have a strong sense of aesthetics, but I really care how things look. In fact, it's my wife who doesn't care how things look, obviously. But what about protein? When a person eats pure protein, there is little, perhaps, or no response to insulin. That depends on a few variables. But when a person eats pure glucose, insulin will climb up by orders of magnitude and stay elevated for a minimum of about 3 hours. Now, I say minimum because this is what it looks like in a person who's insulin sensitive, where the glucose rises, that triggers the insulin release because one of insulin's main effects is to lower blood glucose. And in a person where insulin works well, the glucose comes down and then the insulin can come down. However, most people are not insulin sensitive. And so the insulin spike not only goes up multiples higher than it would have otherwise, but it stays elevated for 4 or 5 or even 6 hours, depending on the person. To put all of this in perspective then, one last time, when we start to look at how people eat, the uncommon individual's only eating 3 times a day. And so insulin may look like this. But of course, the common individual has to have a morning snack, an afternoon snack, and then an evening snack. And so they're spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. And in most people, in fact, it's even worse than this. In most people that are insulin resistant, it doesn't even attempt to come down throughout the day. The insulin goes so high, it takes so long to come down, that before it's ever had a chance to start coming down, it's been bumped back up by our chronic carbohydrate consumption. Now, when Corey invited me to speak, she had mentioned, I hope it wasn't just a casual comment, an interest to focus a little more on cognition in the brain. Do you remember asking me to do that? Okay, good. So I thought I would devote a little bit of brain power to talking about the brain problem when it comes to metabolism, because the conventional view of Alzheimer's disease is problematic, and there's an opportunity for a new paradigm here. The conventional view, and here are some of the sobering statistics, is that it is solely caused by plaques that accumulate in the brain. But I present this question, and let me defend it in a moment. Are the plaques simply an artifact? Are they just there, or are they driving the actual disease? That's an important question, because if they're driving the disease, then they should be the target. If they're not, and they are simply accompanying the demented brain, well, then let's not waste our time. And there are, in fact, some problems with the plaque-based theory, which is that studies that have looked after post-mortem studies that look at brains of people who died with Alzheimer's disease versus the brains of people who died with perfect cognition, you're just as likely to find plaques in one set of brains as you are the other. Moreover, there are drugs that very effectively reduce plaque formation in the brain, and they do nothing to improve cognition. So we need a new view of this disease, and that is what's contributing to a view that's actually been around for decades, but is getting its kind of moment in the sun as the plaque-based theory is dying or being appropriately challenged. The metabolic theory is stepping up to take its place. In the metabolic view, it's based on the idea that the brain is very hungry, that it is, in fact, one of the high metabolic rate organs of the body. It's in this sort of trinity of organs that are unlike all the rest, where they are constantly operating at a very high metabolic rate. The brain is number 3. So it needs a lot of energy, like a high-performance engine. How can you expect that car to continue to operate so well if it's running out of fuel? It's going to start to kick and chug along. Well, the brain is no different. But like that high-performance engine, or unlike it, the brain is a metabolic hybrid. And it can use glucose, which is the only fuel that anyone ever talks about, but it can also rely on the alternative fuel, ketones. The interesting point about ketones is that the ketone entrance into the brain is unregulated. There's no checkpoint. There's no bouncer at the door determining whether the ketone can come in. If the ketones are going up in the blood, the brain pulls them in greedily without needing to be told what to do, like an obedient child. I have 3 kids at home, which is why Dr. Reynolds and I are flying back home tonight to give my wife a break. Now, the glucose, on the other hand, is regulated. There's a checkpoint, a stop. There's a bouncer at the door who is going to look at the glucose and say, all right, you can come in. But what if the bouncer isn't working well? In other words, what if the brain's becoming insulin resistant? That is a regulated point and thus prone to problems. Now, I've mentioned ketones. Let me take a moment as your temporary professor to just define ketones. Ketones are a problem, derivative of depending on the fuel use of the body. The body, by extension, is actually a complicated hybrid where we have multiple fuels that we're using. The main fuels are glucose or blood sugar or fat. So at any given moment, the body is burning a balance where it's either sugar burning or it's fat burning, or a little bit of both. Now, when a body, and in fact, what decides that, what flips that fuel line switch is the hormone insulin. If insulin is elevated, the body is sugar burning almost entirely. If insulin is low, the body is shifted to fat burning. And in fact, if insulin has been low in the realm of around 16 to 18 hours, it's burning so much fat that it starts to produce ketones. Ketones are simply products of fat burning. To demystify them, and over the next few slides, I'm also going to debilify them, Because there are few nutrients or molecules in the body that have been more wrongly accused of crime than ketones have been. And not only are they not metabolic garbage, as they were referred to for so long, they are in fact heroes of metabolism. And every single cell of the body with mitochondria, which is pretty much every cell except red blood cells, will greedily use ketones as a fuel. Okay, so in the fed state, so if part of your snacking involved carbohydrates, the high insulin level shifted the brain metabolism to relying 100% on glucose. However, if you enter what's commonly called the fasted state, up to 75% of the brain's energy is coming from ketones. Let me just help put that in perspective, because you can be in a fasted state where the glucose is at about 5 millimolar and the ketones may be about 2. Let's say 2.5 millimolar, just for simple mathematics. So the ketones will be at half the concentration as the glucose, and already in that state, more than 3/4 of the energy is coming from the ketone, not the glucose. So if the brain prefers any fuel, in contrast to what is commonly taught, it is not the glucose. If the brain has a preference, even if it's at a lower level, it's still selectively relying on the ketone. Now, when it comes to cognition or Alzheimer's disease, that becomes particularly relevant. Because in Alzheimer's disease, Dr. Stephen Cunnane at Sherbrooke University, Northern Canada, boy, doesn't he wish he were in Arizona right now. He found that in early-stage Alzheimer's disease, the brain has a significant reduction in its ability to use glucose as a fuel. But its ability to use ketones is unaffected. Remember, there is no checkpoint regulating the movement of those ketones. My lab, and you'll note this was a paper from my work at BYU, and indeed the work of my PhD student, Erin, she came from a kind of a neuro background, and I wanted to get into the brain, but I'm not a brain guy. And so I said, you're perfect. Let's look at the brain. So this was one of the papers we published where we looked at the degree to which brains of people who died with and without Alzheimer's disease, what the expression of these metabolism genes had changed, how they had changed. Every single gene involved in glucose metabolism in the regions of the brain involved in cognition were significantly downregulated. In contrast, not a single gene of ketone metabolism was compromised. So we found that at the very level of the genetics, which is very influenced by lifestyle, the expression of these genes, you saw differences in the ability of the brain regions involved in cognition to metabolize these two fuels. Now, another paper was published a number of years ago, and it was done in Sweden. And one of the beauties of Scandinavia is their ability to rely on very accurate record keeping, where they can take patients who get diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and then look back in time, because they've been coming in every year and getting all these blood tests measured. And so it becomes very powerful to retrospectively look at the variables that could have prospectively predicted who got Alzheimer's disease and who didn't. And they identified 8 very significant values. 3 of them weren't overly surprising. The older you are, the more likely you are to have Alzheimer's disease. The less educated you are, the more likely you are to have Alzheimer's disease. In fact, one of the reasons I learned to play the piano again was to help train my brain and challenge myself to help stave off cognitive decline. And then ApoE4, the ApoE4 gene, also played a part of this. Now let me mention that, because you're probably thinking, well, then plaques do matter. Well, it's not the plaques that appear to matter, but ApoE4, when it encodes for its protein product, the protein actually disrupts the insulin receptor. So even this gene, far from the problem being the plaques that may come from its misfolded proteins, it could be that the protein itself is compromising the insulin receptor. And so we still come back to the metabolic view. Now, this is 3 of the 8, and you're wondering, what about the other 5? Well, they all have something in common, which is that they're all metabolic. So 5 of these 8 variables that predicted retrospectively who would get Alzheimer's disease were related to problems of blood sugar and insulin. It's a metabolic problem. This is why more and more people are referring to Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes. Now, I confess that's not a term I like. It should just be called insulin resistance of the brain. But type 3 diabetes has a better ring to it. So I can respect that from a marketing standpoint. So the problem then, when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, is that the brain becomes insulin resistant and is thus less capable of fueling its high performance. And so performance suffers, and that's manifested as cognitive decline. Now, there are more and more studies to show that ketones are extremely therapeutic for Alzheimer's disease. In fact, I never want to be seen as an advocate of ketogenic diets. I certainly don't mind being seen as a defender. I will certainly defend ketones from the uninformed, but the only time where I actually beat the drum of ketones is if someone has cognitive decline. That the brain appears to be the most responsive tissue in the body. Here's one among many and more getting published every month showing how ketones are therapeutic for cognition. But interestingly, the problem, just as a brief tangent, goes beyond just Alzheimer's disease. You can also treat depression with ketones. You can treat migraines. In fact, the oldest studies I've ever seen from around 1910 on ketogenic diets actually studied ketogenic diets in the context of migraines, where you can have someone who experiences frequent migraine headaches, they adopt a ketogenic diet, and they may never have one again. Same with epilepsy. The standard of care used to be just start with the ketogenic diet, and the child would never have another seizure in many instances. Okay, now, one final comment in cognition. I'm sorry, don't get your hopes up. I'm not done, but it's still going to be interesting, so don't tune out yet. When I was a little boy, I think that's my origins of the poem I'm about to cite here, that you think about when I went to, in 6th grade, it was the first time, and actually the only grade ever, I was sent to the principal's office multiple times. In my defense, the deck was stacked against me. I have 7 older brothers, and I think by the time I got to 6th grade, the teacher was so tired of those damn little Bikmans that I was doomed. I had no chance of being given a clean slate. So my principal, where I grew up in southern Alberta, the punishment would be that you had to memorize poetry. And one of the poems I memorized, at least a portion, was the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where you may recall it's the sailor who ironically is stranded at sea and dying of dehydration. And yet he's surrounded by water, and he bemoans the irony where he says, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. This is the plight of the Alzheimer's brain when it comes to metabolism. That ironically, the body can be swimming in a sea of glucose, and the brain can't get it. And it's crying out for the alternative fuel, namely the ketones, acting as a life preserver. And because of the person's chronically elevated insulin, they are inadvertently depriving the brain of the one fuel that the brain is crying out for. So this is the brain's version of the rime of the rime of the demented brain, we'll call it. Okay, so what can you do? Hopefully I have scared you guys into some action, and you are prepared to make some uncomfortable changes. Well, the solution, I'm going to present this when I talk about drugs in just a moment, but I have to kind of present it in the context of type 2 diabetes, because that's how some of these drugs are originally or initially marketed. But hopefully I've impressed upon you the problem with type 2 diabetes in the conventional view, which is that if we just look at it as a glucose problem, as I'm going to show you in a moment, we actually make things worse. But the solution must be reducing insulin. Any intervention you may have in mind to correct or prevent insulin resistance, if it does not involve lowering insulin, it will not work. So we're going to talk about drugs and diet. And the drugs I'm going to talk about, for the sake of time, are just going to be these two. And they actually fall into two classes, two classes. Sulfonylureas and insulin, which I'll introduce in a second. And we're going to talk a little bit, more than a little bit, about the GLP-1 drugs. You've heard of them, even if that doesn't sound familiar. All right, let's come back to this view right now. So the justification for sulfonylureas and insulin is we're going to push up the insulin even more because that's going to bring down the glucose. And that's justifiable if you have a glucose-centric view of metabolic health. You think, to hell with insulin. I don't care what insulin is going to do. I just need to lower glucose at all costs. Most conventionally trained clinicians won't have even measured insulin. It's not even on the clinical radar. And so who cares if we're pushing it up even higher? Sulfonylureas act as what's called an insulin secretagogue, where it will kick the beta cells of the pancreas into making even more insulin. And then, of course, sometimes an insulin-resistant type 2 diabetic will just be given insulin therapy, so they're directly injecting it. So this is the justification. We're lowering glucose, and thus we are keeping Medicaid happy. And we can bill the visit and get a bonus or something. Unfortunately, nothing gets better. This meta-analysis that I'm showing you a quote from here concluded that nothing gets better when you give the type 2 diabetic insulin therapy. In fact, reason with me for a moment, if you will. If you give a hyperinsulinemic type 2 diabetic more insulin, what will that do to the insulin resistance? Doesn't take a genius to figure that out, does it? No surprise. We're giving them more of the very thing that's causing the problem. It is like giving an alcoholic another glass of wine. And I appreciate the irony of me using that metaphor as a professor at BYU, the most stone-cold sober campus in the country. All right, so insulin increases insulin resistance. Yes, indeed, it does, and it does so very well. I'm just highlighting a couple studies that have documented this inconvenient truth. But what about Alzheimer's disease? Well, it makes the problem worse. This study found that when you put a type 2 diabetic on insulin therapy, the risk of Alzheimer's disease goes up by 21%. That's not insignificant if you're a person who cares about that sort of thing. Now, let's talk about the most popular drugs on the planet, probably right now. GLP-1 receptor agonists. Before I mention the drugs themselves, let me just define the hormone. GLP-1 is a hormone that is made from the intestines in the body. So we all have it. We're making it right now. And it has myriad effects. The most famous effects are that it will slow the rate at which food is moving through the stomach, giving us a sense of more bulk in the intestines, making it less likely for us to continue to eat. And at the same time, complementing that effect is a central stimulus where the GLP-1 comes from the guts and goes to the brain and tells the brain, you're full, you're satiated, you do not need to continue to eat. So it's no surprise that these drugs that the hormone is being leveraged to promote weight loss. Now, on the metabolic side, it will improve insulin resistance, or GLP-1 acts in a favorable way. You're eating less, and indeed, there's another signal of GLP-1 to help lower blood glucose through the actions of a different hormone. But if you're helping blood glucose come down, naturally, you're going to help insulin come down, and you're addressing insulin resistance at the base of the problem. Now, GLP-1 is a relevant hormone, and it's not inappropriate for conventional clinical care to focus on it. Let me share with you a paper published in 1996, which, in addition to being a banner year for high school graduates, it was also an interesting year for scientific discovery. They had two groups of people, separated into two groups based on body fat, lean group and the obese group. And they gave them, first and foremost, a fat meal, so basically a load of fat. And they looked at the GLP-1 response, and they found that it was roughly similar, certainly at the front end. And you could say, well, the obese group had a bit of a diminished response later. Yeah, that's fair enough, but still pretty close. This suggests that whether the individual was lean or obese, the satiety effect of the fat would be roughly similar between the two groups. So if the person ate some fat, the signal to the brain and the guts would help them eat less. But when they had them eat carbohydrate, the response was fantastically different. That the obese group had no statistically significant response whatsoever to carbohydrate, unlike the lean group, which had a significant response. So what if some of obesity is a result of someone eating the insulin-spiking carbohydrates, and one group will eat them and say, I'm done, I'm good, thanks. The other group eats them and just isn't getting a signal to stop. And so once they've emptied their plate, rather than pushing it back to stand up and be done, they're pushing it back for a second helping of whatever the carbohydrates are that they just ate. So I present this in defense of a GLP-1 view. I feel like I need to do that in order to impress upon you the fact that I'm not declaring war on these drugs, but I am certainly declaring consideration because they are not without consequence. Now, if GLP-1 doesn't ring a bell, the name of some of these drugs probably will. This is some of the brand or trade names of some of these drugs. The drug name with the molecule name, or like as their sold name, and then the drug itself. But they all share the effect of mimicking what GLP-1 is doing in the body. Now, problems with this is that once you start injecting to artificial levels the stimulus of this hormone, some of its effects can go too far, including case reports finding that as people increase their dose of these drugs, their intestines are paralyzed, that they're stopping moving. They're slowing down so much to the point of stopping. That's a problem, and indeed it has killed some people. Another problem was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it found that for every 6 pounds of fat the body loses on these drugs, it's losing 4 pounds of fat-free mass. Now, some of that will include water, just for full disclosure, but some of it will also include muscle and bone, which is not a tissue we want to be running out of. Now, what about the cravings? The main reason someone will take the drug, whether they acknowledge it or not, and indeed, the main reason I would justify its use would be to control cravings. Because as I showed you in that study from 1996, the people in the obese category had almost no satiety response to the carbohydrate. So it's more likely they're going to keep going back. What about cravings? How does it help them get that signal to stop eating? Well, a paper was just published that gives some unfortunate news on this in this regard. What they did is give people a regular questionnaire, a survey to determine how much they were craving sweet things. And this is the results. So the baseline of 0 would be right where they started. At about 6 months, there was a significant reduction in their sweet cravings. So it's working. They're eating less. When they sit down to turn on a movie in the evening, they're not getting this craving to go to the cupboard or the fridge for something sweet and gooey or salty and crunchy. At 1 year, the effect persisted. They still had a significant reduction in cravings. But 1 year after that, it was gone. They were right back to normal, all while continuing to take the drug. You can see why people are tempted to start increasing the dose on their own, increasing the risk of paralyzing their intestines, because the food noise, as it's commonly called, is starting to come back. The cupboard is suddenly starting to call out to them in a way that it didn't before. This is diminishing returns, and of course it happens with every drug. Now, one last comment that I'm inclined to make in the midst of this mental health crisis that we appear to be having is just what these drugs do to mental health. This paper was just published within the last 2 months. You can see why I'm inclined to share it, because it is so sobering what's happening here, where you see a dramatic increase in the risk for depression, anxiety, and suicidal behavior. What's interesting then about this drug is that while it dampens the cravings for things like sweets, what if it dampens the cravings for life? What if it is dampening your enthusiasm to go play pickleball with your friends? What if it's dampening your enthusiasm for getting online and playing video games? Yeah, I teach college students, so pardon that example. But whatever it may be, maybe another way of saying the food noise is gone is my interest in life is simply going down. Everything's going gray. In the mid-90s, I lived in Russia shortly after communism ended, and I'd never seen so much gray. It was just so plain. There was no color in the absence of a free market. And I wonder, is that maybe how people feel on these drugs, that life is just less enjoyable? All right, that's enough on that. One final comment. Perhaps as a result of all of these variables, at about 2 years in, 70% of Americans on the drug get off the drug on their own without it being physician prescribed. They get tired of these effects, presumably. All right, now what happens when they do get off? Well, they gain weight back a lot. That's this bottom line. You can see there's a substantial immediate rebound in weight gain. But the generous perspective, maybe naive perspective, would be, well, but they didn't gain it all back 1 year later. Yeah, but what do they gain back? Imagine, if you will, a 60-year-old woman. Now, I only pick a woman because of the unique problem with lean mass retention in females as opposed to males. Imagine we have a 60-year-old woman who lost 100 pounds, just for easy math, on the drug. She lost 60 pounds of fat. She lost 40 pounds of lean mass. Guess which one of those masses is actually coming back very quickly? And one may never come back. That muscle and bone in that 60-year-old gal is gone. Sure, she may be able to regain some. You can see why I encourage some slowing down of enthusiasm for these drugs. As powerful as they can be to correct weight gain and metabolic health, and they also need to be used very judiciously. Now, what about diet? I want to get through this in good time. There are 3 pillars matching the 3 macronutrients. In order to address insulin resistance, we must manage macronutrients. So in control carbs, please understand I'm not declaring war on carbohydrates as a macronutrient, not at all. But I said it earlier that it really is whole fruits and vegetables, eat them, enjoy them. And one reason for that is that they have more fiber. And when we eat more fiber with our starches and sugars, we dampen the glucose in the insulin response, making it a much more favorable carbohydrate. But also, there's a timing, there's a temporal aspect to it, which is put carbs in their proper place, which is at the end of the meal, insofar as you can. Studies in humans have shown that if you eat the exact same number of calories across the 3 macronutrients, but you put carbohydrates at the end, the insulin and glycemic response is about half. It's about a 47% reduction in those levels. So carbs come last. And that could entirely be a result of the GLP-1 response. Now, what about protein? I appreciate that I have a bit more of a mature audience than my undergraduates, so this point becomes even more important. Thankfully, because I'm a scientist, I don't have to be bothered by cultural pressure, and I can state it decisively and conclusively that animal protein sources are superior to any plant-sourced proteins. Now, you continue to do what you will, but I don't have to be swayed by cultural pressure. It is an absolute fact of human biology. Humans respond better to animal proteins than plant proteins. Especially, a paper actually was just published finding that phenomenon is even more important as we age. That a young person's body is so capable of taking inferior sources of nutrition and making it work. The older body experiences something called anabolic resistance. Our ability to turn dietary protein or amino acids into the amino acids of muscle and substance is less. So we don't have time to waste on the inferior protein. So this phenomenon becomes all the more important with age. And in fact, to put a fine point on it, with age, you actually need more protein than you did when you were 25 or 30, because we become less capable at converting the dietary protein into the protein substance. And then lastly, don't fear fat. I've kept this together because in nature, they always come together. There's no exception, zero, no exception. Literally, every single protein in nature comes with fat. And I don't use the word literally too liberally, like the kids do these days. I mean literally, every single protein in nature comes with fat. That's how we should eat it. When we eat them together, we digest the protein better, and we, once again, have a better, bigger anabolic response to the protein. So here they are. Now, one final comment on this part, before an actual final comment, is what does eating this way do to GLP-1? If the view of obesity is that it's driven by a lower GLP-1, can we leverage nutrition in a way to increase GLP-1? A paper was just published and had people eat 2 different meals. And they had the same matched with calories and matched for protein, a low-fat version and a low-carb version. And the low-carb version of the meal increased the GLP-1 response almost 3 times higher than the low-fat meal. So a significantly higher GLP-1, suggesting a significant improvement in the person's ability to say, I'm full, I don't need to eat anymore. All right, now one final point I wanted to make. Drugs can help. Diet can help, but even unconventional interventions like uncomfortable temperatures can also help. There is an abundance of research, in fact, so substantial that the book that Corey mentioned, one of the books that I've published, I have a whole section devoted to just the interventions of cold immersion. That when the body starts to get cold, we have a significant improvement in metabolic health, including even insulin sensitivity. It lowers glucose, which in turn is going to, of course, lower insulin. Now, how does it do this? What is the effect of the cold? There are at least two mechanisms that I will elaborate now, and I did in my book, although in hindsight, I could have described many more mechanisms. There are multiple, but it is shivering and it is brown fat. The effect of shivering is that when we start to have to warm the body, the muscles start spasming because there's a lot of biochemical reactions happening, and the more biochemistry there is, the more heat there is being produced. Of course, muscles, when they shiver, are big, hungry organs. They want to eat a lot, and so they start eating a lot of glucose and fat. But as it's eating more glucose, in order to fuel the flame of metabolism, to literally heat the body, the glucose levels can come down and then insulin can come down. So it is common for a person to have a higher blood glucose level, get into the bath, and then over the ensuing hours, steadily sit back and enjoy the decline in the glucose. And then the other aspect is the brown fat. Most people don't appreciate that within the human body, one way of classifying the adipose tissue is by its color. That the white fat is the fat that is beneath our skin that we can pinch and jiggle, as well as the visceral fat. Those are both very white adipose depots. When we were taking biopsies at my lab, indeed, it is a very yellowish white. But humans also have brown adipose tissue, mostly sprinkled throughout the thoracic cavity, which is why I've had it animate in the upper chest. It has an extremely high metabolic rate. As we've measured the metabolic rate from brown fat cells, it's about the same as muscle. Very, very high. And its sole purpose, that's not fair, its primary purpose is to create heat. And it uses a lot of glucose. So when you've dipped in, especially if you're in a bath and you get up to your neck, you've fully immersed up past the clavicle, and that brown fat is now getting turned on, and it starts chewing through fat. And then one thing that my lab and others have focused on is that when you're really cold, with the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, you also start to have your white fat behave like brown fat, a phenomenon referred to as beiging. You create what's commonly called beige fat. It's still white, but it's acting like brown fat. So, in the time we've had together with me as your temporary professor, you've allowed me to teach you the problem, the main metabolic problem worldwide. Where does it come from? How does it affect the brain? And even the good news of what to do about it. Because as common and scary as the problem is, it is also one that can be readily changed, primarily by changing the diet. The food we eat is either the culprit or the cure. Thanks so much, and I'll be happy to answer questions before we rush to here. Thank you. Thank you very much.